Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us today. My name is Scarlett Reynoso, and on behalf of Ethisphere, I am pleased to welcome you to the live webcast of Reducing Cybersecurity Risk, Cross-Functional Responsibility at the GC, CCO, and CISO level. Over the next hour, you will hear from my colleague, Craig Moss, as well as Stuart Cohen from Cybersecurity Collaborative, Tim Callahan from AFLAC, Cheryl Lehman, Jeannie McCarver, and Brian Rossman from US Bank as they discuss how companies increasingly realize that effective cybersecurity and the related protection of intellectual property, confidential information, and trade secrets require collaboration between IT, security, legal, and compliance. If you have ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions and answer them throughout the presentation to make today's session more of a discussion with you. Please use the question feature in the webcast platform. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage you to ask any questions you may have. We are anticipating a handful of questions today, so we will try to answer as many as we can. And if we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you via email. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from us, including the recording of today's webcast and PowerPoint presentation. I will quickly introduce our speakers before diving into today's session. As I mentioned, we are joined by my colleague at Ethisphere, Craig Moss, Executive Vice President, and we are thrilled to be partnering with AFLAC and US Bank. We're joined by Tim Callahan from AFLAC, Cheryl Lehman, Jeannie McCarver, and Brian Rossman from US Bank, as well as Stuart Cohen from Cybersecurity Collaborative. Craig, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Scarlett. So the reason for this session is really that we were looking at the challenges organizations have in improving cybersecurity throughout the organization in a practical way. And one of the things that became clear is that cross-functional collaboration is really critical to improving cybersecurity internally and with the third parties that you deal with in your organization. So I reached out to Stuart from the Cybersecurity Collaborative, and we decided that it would be a great opportunity for us to team up and work together because Ethisphere has such great resources and links into organizations, typically in the general counsels and the chief compliance officer area. And Stuart's organization is very focused on the CISOs and cybersecurity expertise. So this is the first of what may become an ongoing series of webcasts that we're going to do that are really pulling in the CISO community and the GC and Chief Compliance Officer community to tackle issues related to cybersecurity and data governance. Next slide, Scarlett. Next slide, Scarlett. Okay. Oh, no, sorry, back one. My mistake. No, back. My mistake. Sorry. There we go. So what I would like to do now is I'd like to introduce the panelists and ask each of you, I'll start with you, Tim, and then we'll go down the list from US Bank, a little bit on your background and then your role in cybersecurity at your organization. Tim, over to you.
Sure. So a little bit of my background. I retired from the military in 1998 and immediately joined SunTrust Bank at the time. Had the opportunity to work there for about 8 years, helping to build a cybersecurity program, information security program. Was the CISO for a bank in Connecticut for about 4 years or so, and then went back to SunTrust for another 4 years, and then came to AFLAC. So altogether, I've been in the field, in the civilian world anyway, about 20 years. A little bit about our organization. We have so I lead a global organization where I report to the general counsel at AFLAC Inc., and then all of our subsidiaries are under the umbrella program for global cybersecurity, global information security, business continuity, the information governance, kind of the classic examples of what falls into a security program. And it's a little bit, I consider it very advantageous because I work for the General Counsel. We have responsibility, across, the whole compliance, legal regulatory compliance, privacy program, certainly the corporate legal program, as well as federal and government relations.
That's great. Thank you very much. And let me go over then to Brian at U.S. Bank.
Thanks, Craig. Excuse me, Brian Rossman with U.S. Bank. U.S. Bank is the fifth largest bank in the country. It's about 70,000 employees. My job aligns to in the financial services world in the second line of defense, which essentially is risk management and compliance. My title is actually an odd one in the industry. It's Chief Resiliency Officer. So I have a responsibility for a few different things, but germane to this is a technology risk oversight, but then also crisis management and operational resiliency, which is inclusive of business continuity and disaster recovery, as well as a variety of data center resiliency elements. But again, for our purposes here, really concentration on ensuring communication across our enterprise, which is certainly a very large one, and it's critical for us to be successful, to work with Jeannie and Cheryl to make sure that we respond effectively and appropriately across each of our lines of defense.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. So over to you, Jeannie.
Thanks. Jeannie McCarver, also at U.S. Bank, and I lead the cybersecurity legal group for U.S. Bank. And I often say that I became a cyber attorney somewhat by accident. I started out 20 plus years ago in my legal career as a technology attorney. And over the past decade, it has morphed into the majority being cybersecurity. I still support our bank tech and ops groups. And as Brian said, we have a team approach as to how we handle cybersecurity. Another aspect that isn't being represented from the U.S. Bank group today is we also have a privacy group within legal, and so that's a party to me, and we work closely together. The one difference that I noticed from Tim's introduction is our CISO does not report into the General Counsel. Our CISO still reports under the technology umbrella.
I think that's a really interesting distinction that we're going to get back to later when we have a series of questions we're going to go through with the panel. And that's something that I think is a really interesting. Cheryl, I'd love to hear from you now.
Thanks, Craig. So at U.S. Bank, my role is encompassing, I head up the issues management and reputation management function within the public affairs and communications team. In that role, we're responsible for both how we respond to adverse events, whether that is a cyber event or it is a natural disaster or an operational issue, as well as working to proactively tell the U.S. Bank story around corporate social responsibility, ethics and compliance, and those types of topics. And in the event of a cyber event, we would coordinate across the various functions, addressing all communications to the various stakeholders, be it employees, customers, legal, other things like that. We do have what we call an issue response team within the communications function that gets pulled together.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Scarlett, let's go to the next slide. So the situation, and I covered a little bit of this in the opening, but Stuart and I just want to kind of frame the situation, and then you're primarily going to be hearing from the panelists. It's really clear that effective cybersecurity really requires this kind of collaboration. And I think people now understand that cybersecurity is a people, process, and technology issue. And as a result, they're looking for ways to try to broaden the collaboration internally in organizations. The other thing that we think, or that we see quite often, is that there are different silos emerging. And one of the silos that has emerged over recently is really around data privacy. And so one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit today is how organizations are dealing with PII, personal identifiable information, versus confidential information will be one of the themes that comes up in some of the questions. And then the other thing here really is around how do you cascade these controls to third parties? And we know that third parties are an enormous risk factor for a whole host of compliance issues, ranging from corruption to loss of confidential information to cybersecurity. They're really, it's a risk. And in cybersecurity, it doesn't end at the boundary of your organization. All the organizations that you work with are really linked into the data and systems in some way. Stuart, over to you. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this situation.
So thank you, Craig. Yeah, it's a combination of, we had a strategic offsite session with a group of our CISOs and our founding CISOs a couple of months ago. And, one of the topic was really around how do the CISOs get better connected with line of business executives around business issues, and then specifically with general counsels and chief privacy officers around, the social and ethical responsibilities around privacy. So this became one of the key initiatives that we were asked to facilitate by our group of members. And I just want to say, it got reemphasized. We had a call with an SME last week with one of the partners from Alston Bird with a group of our members talking about the California Consumer Privacy Act and all the issues associated with it and how do organizations get together with it. And there were a lot of questions from CISOs and security teams about getting better connected with the rest of their organization. We have a similar call around GDPR coming up this month, and I anticipate more of the same. So the timeliness of this is very important, and we're thrilled to have Tim Callahan on the line with us, who not only has been one of our key members, but is also reports to the general counsel and is up here with the chief privacy officer and has a great perspective on how that can work.
Great. Thanks very much, Stuart. Scarlett, let's go to the next slide. So these are the discussion topics that we're going to cover. We'll go through them one by one. As we go through each one, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'll read through them quickly now, and then I'm going to turn it back to Stuart to get the first one going. So really, collaboration on people, process, and technology. Challenges and solutions to cross-functional collaboration. How do we break down those silos in organizations? Cross-functional incident response, planning, and execution. Incident response is really clearly a key area where cross-functional collaboration is absolutely critical. Data governance in linking privacy, information protection, and cybersecurity. Challenging topic here. And then finally, gaining cooperation of supply chain, procurement, and sales to reduce risk. Those units in your organization that actually have contact with third parties. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Stuart.
So Jeannie, maybe I'd like to ask you, maybe to kick off your perspective on how do you collaborate to orchestrate the people, process, and technology needed to reduce cyber risk, and maybe you can either give an example about how that does work or how that should work, or thoughts you have on how things ought to change in the future.
Sure, thank you. It is imperative that all the groups collaborate because cyber is definitely an area that can't be done in a silo. And I would say that Brian and Cheryl and I, and also our privacy and CISO, we work as, I would say, a pretty well-oiled group. It wasn't always that way when cyber first started and people were floundering as far as who handles what, who even owns cyber. And we went through some different iterations over the years. I would say that cyber is owned by the security group to some perspective, but then when it comes to responding to an actual incident, it rolls over to Brian's group in risk to manage it from an organizational level. We have first response executive team that is an automated type system that brings in the correct people whenever we have an incident, or if a third party vendor has an incident that we may have an impact to. And they also handle this not just from a cyber perspective, but from any type of incident. So they're well versed and organized to handle that. We all work really more as a team than I do with even some of my counterparts in my own department, because these are things that can't be done without taking into consideration what the other people are doing. So, for example, I think the best way we got up to the point we are now is lots of exercises, lots of tabletops, lots of working together on scenarios, and then when real things hit, it just smoothly rolls over to how we've been interacting with each other. A good example too would be you think of cyber, and one group, all they want to do is get the bad guy out if it's a hacker type of situation. Legal is more concerned about privilege and forensics and law enforcement and regulatory and privacy issues. And corporate communications is worried about how we're being perceived in the media and our customers and our employees. So none of them can be done by themselves because they all have impacts to the other group. So I would just say that I think that US Bank has a strong collaborative team in place.
If I summarize Jeannie's words into one word, I would say it's practice. Practice, practice, practice. And what you have to do for a cyber risk perspective is you need to simplify a bit, because cyber falls into a few different categories. It falls into a ransomware type of or DDoS, an inability to access your data. It's a breach aspect where PII is off into the environment. And then there's a malware type of event where your business continuity elements kind of go out the window just a little bit because RTOs can't necessarily be trusted in that space. And you work with people that understand their roles, and the orchestration that happens by somebody who is not an expert in any one thing, but knows the organization and can call on the subject matter experts like Jeannie, who knows technology law, who knows privacy, like Cheryl, who knows up and down how we can communicate, where we should be concerned within media, and like Tim, who knows the ins and outs of, or his team knows the ins and outs of a particular infrastructure or where critical data resides and how it should be protected and recovered.
Brian, maybe you could elaborate before I turn it over to Tim. Elaborate a little bit on how it works as a cross-functional kind of matrix management organization at US Bank, where the CISO is in the IT side of the house. And then we'll turn it over to Tim, where it's a little bit more integrated into the organization from a general counsel and privacy officer standpoint at Aflac. Certainly.
The CISO at US Bank is, well, in a cyber event, is almost always, I probably say 80% of the time, the first one with knowledge of an event. So they're, for all intents and purposes, our first responder. So from my seat, I am generally informed from either the CISO or the CISO's legal partner, which is Jeannie, who's on the phone. And then we have to put into place the machine. And the machine starts by, it's that orchestration layer that says who is going to be affected, which businesses are affected, is there data that's affected, and who are the right people who know the most, and you've already written all of this out, that you can point to and get quickly onto a call. It's not an email, it is always a call. And it's a level set of what you know happens or is happening within the organization. And it's key, you cannot let perfection get in the way of good. You've got to get yourself about 70, 80% of the way there, and the people on the phone who are the experts will give you the extra bits of information or who you may be missing in a certain area. And that's really key, that you don't wait to have everything answered, that you are surfacing what you know to experts within the organization and letting them help guide you through that particular scenario.
Tim, from your perspective?
Yeah, and certainly I definitely agree with all that's been said here. Collaboration, cooperation, each of us knowing our roles, plus how the roles interact in any type of incident or scenario. Among my duties, I'm also responsible for crisis management and kind of overseeing the plan. But we've designated the general counsel as the lead in most of our crisis scenarios. And when you look at what's within that organization across the company, it really makes sense, because under our general counsel is pretty much all the corporate services, as well as, you've got the functional HR, legal, government relations, compliance, regulatory relations, security, kind of pretty much the whole gambit. If you kind of think through a very popular notion of what we call the fusion cell concept, by and large, that's all encompassed within the general counsel's organization. So it does enable us to go into any type of an incident with the peers and the people that we kind of work with all the time. We have certainly an IT component of any incident, and certainly our U.S. CISO, our U.S. CIO, our Japan CIO, and our corporate CIO are all critical parts of this team as well. But by and large, we can manage through, and we have a plan that we practice several times a year at different levels within the organization. And then back to the point that was made earlier, we practice. I think Brian made that point. We practice, and we work together. And then it's very helpful, because as many companies, we have a lot of incidents that are short of a true breach or a major breach at any rate. And so through those incidents, we manage through the little email incident or the misrouted fax, or all these little things that happen. But we pretty much maintain that same protocol. So we're always working together and knowing, how we interact and how we would need to work together in a large incident.
So, Craig, I think this feeds right into the next question that we have.
I think it does. Let's go to the next slide, Scarlett. So what I want to talk about here and ask, I'm going to start with you, Cheryl, is what are the challenges and solutions to cross-functional collaboration? I heard that you have a well-oiled machine now, but how did you break down those silos, and how did you get to become a well-oiled machine with the different departments working together? Cheryl, over to you.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is just confusion around roles and responsibilities. There are teams, IT and security are very used to handling these things, but then you start to bring in other groups that may not have been involved in the past, and you have that push-pull of who's responsible for what. It's also who is the source of truth is another thing in these types of events. People are really trying to do the right thing and get information out as quickly as possible, but sometimes what happens is what I have in corporate communications is different than what Brian has in the risk organization, and we go and tell different people. We're telling two different stories. And so really bringing that group together and bringing the responders together early on helps with that. It also recognizing that the different groups come in with different perspectives and different pressure points. And so once you start bringing all of that together, you can really put the context around what is happening. And so while the business lines may be saying, we need to communicate, we need to communicate, we need to communicate, legal is saying, wait, we need to know what happened because we have to protect the company. And, other people are saying we need to talk to these groups or not communicate at all. And so how do you bring that all together and having those conversations? Like Brian said, it's a phone call because it's faster. It's you get all of the decision makers on the phone and there is a conversation and everyone gets the same context at the same time. And there's the opportunity to ask those questions that you need to ask as you go. And it really helps all of the various parties understand what is needed and why. So you can really get that context behind it.
I think you brought up a couple great points there. Let me go. I'm now going to switch over to Tim and ask you the same question about how did you break down the silos, or if silos still exist, what are some of the challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, I think part of our challenge is our geography to some degree. So, one of our major insurance subsidiary is in Japan, and with the time difference and substantial work style differences, cultural differences, things like that. When if we have an incident that crosses our whole geography, then we are challenged a little bit of making sure that everybody is hearing the same message, that we're communicating the same way, that we're understanding the same way, and that challenge we overcome by practice, by frequent exchanges. For instance, our U.S. CSO is actually in Japan, went over to spend a year in Japan to help understand that environment, to help the Japan CISO in organizing a security ops function, and then to just create a good communication path across the ocean, and that's helped us to bridge some of those challenges that we had from a understanding communication kind of standpoint. I think the approach that we've taken organizationally has helped really break down the silos. Although I don't report into the IT organization, I am very much connected into that organization. We share, in staff meetings, we do a lot of initiatives together just to keep the conversation flowing and the understanding flowing, and working together on making sure that we're mitigating risks together. Just helps us in communicating, understanding, and keeping that connection.
So let me ask Jeannie, from your perspective in the legal department, how do you see it playing out, and how did you start to get that cross-functional collaboration going?
Well, I think the cross-functional collaboration really, like Brian said, it all came out of practice, and it really came from top down. So if your executive leadership is expecting people to work together and to collaborate on these types of issues, it filters down. I would say that one of the challenges that we have now isn't so much between legal, compliance, security, and corporate communications. It's with the affected business line in an incident, because they're not part of all the practices, and they're not part of knowing how other scenarios or situations have played out. They panic and try to do things from their gut instead of calm down. We've seen this before. These are the steps we're going to take. We're not going to the media yet, or we're not going to tell customers things until we know that we have our facts correct. We're going to funnel all our communications through Cheryl's group so that they are not only accurate, but everybody hears the same thing and different customers aren't hearing different things. So I would say the biggest challenge isn't necessarily these 4 key groups collaborating. It's getting your arms around the other groups that may be impacted once in a while versus being part of the team, and making them realize we know what we're doing. Let's calm down. The other thing that, from just a legal perspective, that I would say is my challenge with all groups is around privilege and keeping things privileged and protected within the company, knowing it's a really fine line in this type of situation, because if we have an incident, clearly the most important thing is fixing it, and if somebody's in your system, getting them out. So privilege takes somewhat of a back seat, but it then later on can be impactful on how things play out. So it's just reminding people of privilege, trying to set up controls where we can, but knowing that at the end of the day, you know, the customer's data, money, and the company's reputation are going to trump privilege.
Yeah, and I think Jeannie, did bring up a good point, and something that we try to keep in mind and need to keep in mind. It's one thing to keep the corporate entities, kind of on one page, and I think we do that well. But it's very important. We have a very significant sales force that primarily are made up of independent agents, and to the end customer, that's not necessarily known or acknowledged or whatever. They see Aflac as one company, and the agent they deal with is one company. So it's very important to keep that field force informed of what's going on, at least from having, a script, the same, type communications that we give to our internal call center, and those kinds of things, to try to keep the whole company on one message. I think that's a tremendous challenge. I'm sure for U.S. Bank, it's a challenge because, again, they have a network of branches. When I was in banks myself, that was always a challenge, because if the customer hears somebody or something on the news and they have a question, they're going to tend to go to the people that they ask or they deal with every day. They're not going to necessarily call the corporate communications department or anyone else. So getting that message out across the whole company, I think, is very important.
That's great. And I actually had a question on planning, but I'm going to let Scarlett, we'll go to the next slide, because I think we're going to get into some of the planning on the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Stuart. So Scarlett, let's go. There we go. Stuart, back over to you. And I was actually going to ask Brian about planning, but I'll let you lead this one.
Well, maybe I will turn it over to Brian for you. And Brian, you can talk about, as it relates to incident response specifically, both from a planning and execution side. And then maybe, Tim, you can comment on, how do you break the ties between when IT and the CIO and the data is on versus the issues around privacy and some of the social and ethical responsibilities around privacy and customer information, if you will. So, but Brian, let me start with you.
I think we touched on a lot of this earlier on. The response planning aspect of it is again, it's probably getting yourself to where you think you're about 70 or 80% there, so you don't continue to iterate over and over and over again. Because when you start to practice the actual incident response with your key team members, across the enterprise, you're going to figure out during that time frame what's going wrong and what's not. We just this week did a European interruption where we worked a tabletop where Visa went down, and we do a significant amount of work on transaction processing within Europe. And the challenge to the team members or the executive leadership in Europe was to figure out, do they have all of the right elements within their plan? And we had 4 or 5 lessons learned of elements, even though this is the 5th, 6th time we've done this, of different items and different constituents that we need to ensure that we bring into the fold. So I would say, once again, it's don't let perfect get in the way of good, and then continue to practice that.
This is Cheryl. The one thing that I would add to that is Brian's team does a really good job when we're doing those exercises of making it clear that it's a no-fault environment, which enables people to really have the true conversation as to how should it work, or the fact that they may not know based on the exercise how it might happen. It really opens up that conversation, which is important to creating the collaboration.
And this is Jeannie, to parlay off of both of their comments. When Brian says, you're 70, 80% there and you're not looking to be perfect, I would suggest that you actually would never want to be perfect. And that's based on examples from years ago when we first, were getting into cybersecurity, and people were asking us for definitive, all-inclusive checklists of what should happen when something occurs. And every situation varies so much, and it always has a different nuance. There's never a complete repeat. So what you really want is Brian's group being to that 70 to 80%, and then having experts on the call, like he mentioned, that can brainstorm and think through issues that you would never think of in a vacuum to put on a checklist. Because if you don't ask the right questions and you go off of a checklist, you will miss something every time.
Tim, do you want to talk a little bit about the incident response planning and execution, and kind of potentially, breaking ties between the IT organization and the legal organization or community organization?
Yeah, certainly. I do think that incident response is born out of a good planning process. So, within each of our departments, our functions, our lines of business, we have, our business continuity plan. So essentially, how would you operate in a less than austere or a less than desired situation? So I think having that grassroots conversation around that is very important, because you find yourself in a cyber incident, and depending on what scenario you're in, you could be in a denial of service, you could be in a ransomware where your files are not available, you could be in massive malware or a data breach scenario. But thinking through that and just continuing to ride that up the ladder. I mean, we generally have 3 levels of incidents. There's probably subcategories of those, but we tend to talk about the local, what's localized, and generally a malware incident can be a very localized incident to one of our regions or to one of our subsidiaries or to one of our banks. So we kind of think about it from that standpoint. And then, as it progresses up to be, from a local to a regional to a global type incident, steps and running that continuum. And we practice that way too, so that, we have a concept, and I'm sure probably U.S. Bank, other banks I know that I've been involved with, has a concept where if it's a non-critical business continuity plan, then the line of business is responsible to exercise that. My team, ensures through our governance process that they exercise their non-critical plans, and we certainly exercise, as a unit, the critical plans. But again, having that practice and knowing, everyone's responsibility. Knowing that IT is responsible for these things, knowing that legal is responsible for these things, and then bringing it all together, in each of the functional areas to make it look very cohesive as one team is certainly our objective.
Craig, why don't I turn it back over to you for the next question to make sure we can get a couple of these and then a few minutes at the end to answer any questions that might come in over the chat box.
Perfect. And just to remind you, if any of you in the audience do have questions, feel free to send in the chat. Or, you can always follow up later with questions, but we'd love to hear from you. So our next question here is, what is the role of data governance program in linking data privacy, protection of confidential business information, and cybersecurity? And the reason that I bring this up and that we think this is an important issue is we hear more and more about data governance frameworks and how they're existing in different organizations. There's a growing emphasis on data privacy in response to regulatory issues. And how is that playing out in organizations? So with this, I'd like to turn it over to US Bank to start off, because we have different viewpoints on this coming from you. And I'll let maybe Jeannie, you want to start off on this one.
I'm actually going to let Brian start off on this one because it fits more into some of the roles that he has, and then I can chime in if I have anything to add if Brian doesn't mind.
Perfect.
I don't. Data governance is hard. It's really, really hard. It's so theoretical in many ways, but the way I would liken it for this area, for data privacy, protection of confidential business information in cyber, is data governance. You have to think about your authoritative data sources, and you got to minimize them. Because the problem you get with data governance, and when you don't govern data well, data spreads across your enterprise, and that's personal information. I don't just mean PII, I mean all personal information, which is inclusive of a lot of the GDPR elements. If you aren't trying to minimize your data, you're not going to know what to protect and where to actually spend your money in protecting certain assets. So data governance as a program needs to be working very, very hard to help the enterprise minimize their data footprint, and then ensure that the data quality is appropriate and correct, and the data lineage can be then pulled out into the elements of reporting that you would need it for. So if I had to point in one certain direction for the data governance program to help, it would be a minimization of data across your enterprise.
Jeannie, anything that you want to add?
No, I don't know that there's anything to really add, except that it just really goes back to not just the collaboration of the folks on this call and the roles that we support. It's education out to the business lines too, for understanding how important our data is to our business, but how important it is to the consumer and keeping it confidential too.
So let me ask you a question to US Bank at this point. A subset of this is that what we see in some organizations is that data privacy focus, in response to GDPR, is really focused at protecting certain data and keeping it private and within a relatively small access. HR needs to know that there could be very limited pockets of people that need to know that information. Confidential business information inherently seems to be shared much more, shared internally, shared with third parties, distributors, suppliers, things like that. Do you see in your organization, how do you balance the need to protect and keep private some information with other information that you want to protect, but inherently you have to share with throughout the organization and with third parties?
I would start with the personal data first and foremost, and I would encourage those on the phone or anywhere really, that you should think broadly about personal data, because your customers almost entirely are the lifeblood of the organization. If you lose customer confidence, especially within a bank, everything else doesn't really matter down the road. So to endeavor to protect personal information, not just PII, but look at what is the risk appetite of your organization aligned to elements like GDPR, and then decide how best to protect that personal data. So we concentrate the vast majority of our resources in that space. The confidential data is interesting because you've got to realize that you have to, like, as you mentioned, Craig, you have to share that data out with your third parties, out with your customers. So you just got to make sure that you're doing business in an ethical manner. Realizing certainly there's some things that are strictly confidential to how the business operates and could give somebody a competitor a leg up on something you're doing from a strategic standpoint. But that really is, we really do put that on the onus of our business lines to protect, and we concentrate most of our resources in the protection of our customer and our employees' personal data. I don't know if that answered your question really well, Craig, but that's how U.S. Bank.
Yeah, no, a fascinating approach. Cheryl, anything you want to add from U.S. Bank before I go over to Tim with this?
I think that Jeannie and Brian have covered pretty much everything. Thank you.
This is Jeannie. The one thing I would just add on to what Brian said was we have a really strong third-party risk management process. So our third parties are vetted pretty highly, and part of that's because we're in such a highly regulated industry. But then in addition to that, we put in strong, non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses in our contracts, et cetera. But with that said, you can't contract around a bad actor. You can do your best, but you can't work around somebody that's their intent is to harm.
Okay. Tim, do you want to respond on this one quickly, and then we'll go on to the next?
Yeah, very quickly, and I'll try not to be repetitive. I certainly agree with the points that have been made, but I mean, one thing I think it's always important is sticking to the fundamentals, right? And I also manage the information governance program, dealing with how we classify data, how we index, our retention schedule. And then certainly the disposable. And when you talk about minimization of data, it's really keeping a strict, know where your data is, know what the data is, know that you're only retaining the data you need to meet legal regulatory requirements and business objectives. And then everything else, you really need to have a good program to shed that information in a defensible disposal manner, a manner in which the information cannot be reconstructed. And we spend you can use a lot of automation. Most organizations of any age, probably have a lot more data than they need. And so we have been really going through a cycle of reviewing what that is, where it is, and then minimizing that. I think GDPR, CCPA, and other type regulations are really putting a burden on companies to up the game there. I mean, if you think about one of the provisions of GDPR is what we call the right to be forgotten. How that implies that if a consumer comes and says we want to be expunged from your environment, that implies that we know where every piece of that information relating to that consumer is, and so that's a real burden on this program, and that's where many of the companies in Europe have struggled with that concept. I've been in several working groups with companies representing, core business in Europe, that's probably the hardest aspect. But certainly you approach that from the same standpoint as anything else. As you draw your plan, you draw your requirements, you have a go forward from here forward. This is how we're going to do it, and then do a backwards look and trying to ingest information and put it into a repository that you can continuously look at it, wash it, and make sure that you're applying the rules as automated as possible.
And of course, access control gets tied into all of that as one of the critical components.
Yes.
Stuart, over to you. I think we have one more question, and then we do want to, as you said, leave a little time at the end.
Yeah, I think, we've talked about IT and we've talked about PII information a lot. If you think about maybe the other aspect of customer data and supply chain and the sales influence of that information, maybe Janine, I'll give it to you first to see if you want to answer this from a U.S. Bank perspective, or if you want to offer it to one of the other folks on your team.
Oh, this is Jeannie. That's fine. I kind of think of supply chain and procurement as kind of rolled into one, so I'll kind of talk to them together. But our procurement group works very closely with the law division. So there's a lot of education back and forth, quite frankly, on what we need, but what's the appetite that they're actually seeing from third parties. So, from my perspective in the legal area, a lot of it is contractual. That's typically my interaction with third parties, since I'm not in sales or in the actual business line. But we do what we can to protect the data and the company. We put in audit provisions so that we can obviously audit their systems and facilities, and try to reduce our risk where we can. I would go back again towards, and this may fall more into Brian's group, I'm not sure, but it's a lot of it's education with the third party risk management group, everybody kind of working together, because the salespeople are going to do what they think is best for the company and the customer, but if they don't know the risks, they're not going to work around them. So it's an enterprise issue. It's not one group's problem.
Brian, you want to comment on that?
It is, if you don't have this one's really hard, because supply chain and procurement to me is a combination of third party risk. If you don't have a third party risk program that is vetting your third parties appropriately, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble, because you're not going to hold your third parties contractually obligated, and you're not going to have the ability to really enforce anything. So I think what Jeannie said in the earlier question about having a strong third party risk program is critical in the space, because they have to take the lead in it. I don't think it's realistic that any company's individual third party relationship owners, because there's so many, can do it on their own. A program is key to making sure that works, and that's also key from an incident management standpoint as well, because they need to be engaged and involved in any kind of response.
Craig, maybe I'll just make one comment on this, and then I'll turn it back over to you, and then we can let each one of the panelists kind of give their closing remarks and some perspective on it. But I think this just points out, as you look at supply chain, as you look at procurement, as you look at incident response, and you look at some of the PII information, how this really leads to, what we talked about as next steps. As we want to identify what are the top issues where general counsels, privacy officers, and CISOs can work better together. And then we want to work on developing a guidance for that member community of both the Ethisphere community and the CISO collaborative community. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to to do some of the things that our founders asked us to do when we originally got connected with you. And maybe I'll turn it over to you then, to give your perspective on next steps, and then allow some kind of closing remarks from each of the panelists.
Perfect. Thanks, Stuart. Scarlett, next slide. Yeah, here we go. So one of the things that we've talked about with Stuart is the idea of forming a joint working group. And the purpose of this would be to really identify top 3 issues to focus on. Based on the discussion we had today, there could be other challenges that are coming up for the people in the working group. From there, to start to draft some kind of guidance for the member community. It doesn't have to be long and elaborate, a full white paper, but just some guidance. What are the thoughts from people in the working group on trying to address this challenge? And there are different ways that we could collect information that would feed into that. And then finally, then present this in follow-up sessions, and come back to the group here. We had great turnout today to go back to the group that was here, to go back to our organization, at Ethisphere, to our members in the Bella community, for Stuart to go back to the members in his community, and start to facilitate more discussion and dialogue around how do we pull these pieces together to manage some of the challenging issues that come up. So that was really our thinking in this. And if it's something that is of interest to anybody here or anybody that's hearing the recording after the fact, please reach out, get in touch with us, and let us know that you'd like to be part of this working group. So with that, I'll turn it back to, I think we'll start with Tim, and then we'll go through Brian, Jeannie, and Cheryl to wrap up. So Tim, over to you for about a 1-minute closing.
Yeah, so I just want to say, thank you for allowing me to participate in this. This is certainly an area very close to me. I think it's so important. We can see examples of companies when they've had incidents where they did not think through the very thing we're talking about, and their response to it ill-served their customers, their consumer base, and really made a bad situation so much worse. I think companies that think through it, have these conversations, and then exercise and execute on that, do far better when a bad thing happens.
Thanks very much. And we'll go in the reverse order. We'll start with Cheryl and then work our way up the U.S. Bank list. Cheryl?
Yeah, I think, we've heard it throughout the remarks today, but the importance of exercising and planning ahead cannot be underestimated. It does a couple of things, that it helps identify gaps, it helps identify opportunities, but it also allows the responders to get to know each other so that when the pressure is on, you know your colleagues that you're working with, and you know how they're going to respond to a large degree. You know how to reach them, and you know that they're going to be there in the event that something happens. So that I would not underestimate the importance of practicing.
That's great. Jeannie?
I echo everything that's been said. Would just also add that you need to reach out sooner than later. So even if you don't know if something's going to blow up and be a big deal, and it's still just kind of niggling at the background, bring people in early, because then they can start planning and helping you work through the process. And that, I would say, goes not just for legal, but risk and corporate communication, et cetera, because then it gives everybody more time to put a good plan in place.
I think you hit on a really key point there, is get the cross-functional input during the planning stage to make sure that the plans you're developing are practical and are taking into account the viewpoints of all the different stakeholders. And Brian, over to you.
I have nothing else insightful to add. Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much to everybody. Stuart, you want to say goodbye, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just want to thank everybody for participating. Tim, it's always great as one of our founders to be helpful in these type of conversations. And I'm looking forward to doing the work with Ethisphere and the organization Bella Group to focus on what are the key areas that we want to work on together, and then help facilitate that guidance and that output from the members collaborating together.
And I want to thank all the panelists. You all did a great job. I want to thank everybody who attended, and thank Scarlett and Kevin for helping to put this together. And Stuart, thanks. It was great to work with you on this. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.